welcome to everyone who's new and who's joined today for our webinar on improving cancer outcomes with a lifestyle approach with Dr. Shireen Kassam, who really needs no introduction. We're really grateful for your generous donations, which enable us to run this webinar program, along with donations and support from ProVeg International, the support of the webinar platform from veganfitness.com, Oatly, and we're also CPD accredited with the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. All healthcare professionals will receive a CPD certificate in their inbox after this talk. Do also join us in a couple of weeks' time as we're having another incredible webinar, which is with a registered dietitian based in Canada called Michelle Fideli, and it's on nutrition management of patients undergoing cancer treatment. So do spread the word, and the sign-up link is available on our website. For those of you who haven't already checked this out, we recently launched an incredible 21-day plant-based health challenge. And this was started by Dr. Leila Dagan from Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. It's a 21-day free challenge, and it's available by visiting the health zone of our website at pbhp.uk. And we provide recipes, nutritional advice, and daily emails as well. So do let anyone know who's interested in kickstarting a plant-based diet. We'll also be running this Comfort Food Classic social for plant-based health professionals members this Saturday, and we still have a few spaces left. So if you are a member and you'd like to join, do sign up via the members area of our website. Thank you again for joining this webinar on a Wednesday evening, and a dark Wednesday evening, and for supporting our work. Membership is open to everyone, not just healthcare professionals, and you can visit pbhp.uk to subscribe to our newsletter and donate via pbhp.uk/donate. We're also really active on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, so do tag us if you're active on that. But without further ado, I'd love to welcome Dr. Shireen Kassam. I'm just going to stop sharing. She is a huge inspiration of mine and a consultant haematologist and honorary senior lecturer at King's College Hospital with a specialist interest in the treatment of lymphoma. She also founded Plant-Based Health Professionals UK and is the director of Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, and I'm sure many of you know her and her work. So I'll pass over to Shireen, and then do join us after the presentation as well, as we'll be hosting a live Q&A with myself, Rahini, and Shireen. And you can ask questions at any point during the presentation using the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen. Please do use that function, as it makes it a lot easier for me to ask the questions. Thank you.
So thank you everyone, and thanks Rahini for the lovely welcome. It's really a privilege to be with you today. It's a large topic, and hopefully we can cover the key points. So just a little bit about me. I'm sure most of you know already. I'm vegan, I'm founder of Plant-Based Health Professionals UK. I work at Winchester University and provide education via a short course online on plant-based nutrition, and recently certified as a lifestyle medicine physician. But my main job is also as a haematologist at King's College Hospital. I'm not really going to talk much about haematology today, but if anyone's interested in the impact of diet on the risk of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, then this is a reference to a journal article that I wrote with some of our team members on the topic. So what I hope to cover today is the role of nutrition and lifestyle for cancer prevention, challenges and areas of research for nutrition therapy during cancer treatment, and then nutrition and lifestyle approaches for improving survival after a cancer diagnosis. So all my patients, when I deliver a diagnosis of cancer, ask me these questions. Is it something I did? Is it genetic? Is there anything I can do to improve my chances? And what about supplements? So we'll definitely answer all those questions as we go through. So I think we're likely to have an international audience. So the global stats for cancer are that it's the second leading cause of death globally, although in certain countries like Canada, it's overtaken cardiovascular disease as the top cause of death. So around 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 people born will develop cancer in their lifetime, and in the UK, that's 1 in 2 individuals, and 1 in 5 people die from cancer. But over 50% of cases of cancer are due to lung, breast, prostate, and colon cancer. Obviously, mostly lung cancer is due to tobacco smoking, and so I'll concentrate most of my examples and studies with the remaining 3 cancers. And at most, the genes we inherit from our parents contribute to 10% of cases. And all international agencies are quite clear that 40% of cancers could be prevented through diet and nutrition and lifestyle interventions. So Cancer Research UK has great infographics if people are looking for some inspiration. And as I say, 4 out of 10 cases of cancer could be prevented by these simple interventions: stopping smoking or avoiding smoking, maintaining a healthful weight, eating plenty of fruits and vegetables, sensible exposure to the sun, sensible alcohol consumption, and regular physical activity. And just to give an idea of the scale of the problem, in the UK there's about 42,000 cases a year of colorectal cancer, bowel cancer, and here you can see that more than 50% of cases could be prevented. Regarding breast cancer, there are around 55,000 cases of breast cancer a year, and about a quarter could be prevented. And the trouble that's arising now is that many cancers are occurring in younger adults, and this is particularly a problem with colorectal cancer, which in virtually every country studied, there's a rise in incidence by about sort of 1% per year of colorectal cancer in those under the age of 50. And this has happened in a timescale that's too fast to be caused by genetic shift, for example. So it's undoubtedly due to our sort of modern diet and lifestyle. The World Cancer Research Fund latest guidelines have really nicely summarized 9 factors that contribute to cancer development and that we should be using as part of our cancer prevention guidelines. And for me, I don't think the advice is going to change anytime soon. All that's going to happen is that studies are going to come forward that will just reinforce this message that diet and lifestyle approaches are really important. So be a healthful weight, be physically active, eat a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits and beans, limit fast food, limit red and processed meat. For me, it's avoid because there's no necessity at all for these foods in the diet. Limit consumption of sugar, sweetened beverages, predominantly due to its impact on increasing the risk of overweight and obesity and other chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes. Limit alcohol, and really there is no safe limit of alcohol consumption for cancer prevention. Do not use supplements, and I'll come back to that. Breastfeed if you're a mum and if you can, as it has benefits for the mother and the baby. And these recommendations should be followed after a diagnosis of cancer because there's good data to suggest they improve remission rates and survival. And I would urge you all to read this document that was published just a few months ago from the American Cancer Society on diet and physical activity. It goes into great detail on all the questions that people ask about cancer prevention. And I've summarized their recommendations here. There's strong evidence to support a plant-based dietary pattern, to limit red processed meat, sugar sweetened beverages and processed foods in general, and alcohol, because these 3 with arrows in red increase the risk of cancer. Maintain a healthy body weight, physical activity, and don't smoke. There's possible evidence in this column, and I've added green tea. That wasn't in the document, but I think the data is quite compelling for preventing particularly prostate cancer, breast cancer, and colorectal cancer. And there's no evidence that any of this column here that's highlighted contributes to cancer development. And maybe some of these things will come up in the questions. So I'm not really going to concentrate much more on cancer prevention because I think that piece of work is done, and week after week studies come out that support these data. I think what's often forgotten is that chronic disease, such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, renal failure, also contribute to an increased risk of cancer. This study followed over 400,000 Taiwanese people for more than 8 years. And what they found was that about a third of the risk of dying from cancer was because some individuals had underlying chronic disease, as shown on the left. And another third was due to unhealthy lifestyle. And so there's an even bigger impact if you can use diet and lifestyle to prevent the onset of some of our most common chronic illnesses. And it comes back to the shared mechanism of many chronic diseases, which is, in simple terms, inflammation. But what's interesting in this study was, despite having risk factors such as chronic disease and poor lifestyle behaviours, regular exercise was able to reduce the risk of dying from cancer by 40% in these individuals with chronic disease. But I think the area that we as health professionals really need to work upon is raising public awareness. And this survey was conducted in the UK in 2018 and showed that more than 50% of respondents were unaware about the impact of factors such as processed meat and alcohol and physical activity on the risk of cancer. And I've seen a recent survey from America showing exactly the same stats, really. So even though we know this information, we're not getting the message through. And I would suggest that actually awareness amongst health professionals is probably just as poor. And what's really reassuring is that these guidelines actually work in real life. This is a study published earlier in 2020 following 2 large Swedish populations of men and women for 15 years. And even though most people were not actually adhering to the 2018 recommendations for cancer prevention, they were still able to show an impact of healthy lifestyle behaviours. So for each additional healthy lifestyle factor you had, there was a 3 to 4% lower risk of cancer. And those individuals who were the most adherent had a 15% reduction in cancer risk over this long period of follow-up, which is quite remarkable given most people were not actually following the recommendations. And lifestyle really does seem to trump genetics. This is an example of data from the UK Biobank, which compared nearly 3,000 patients with breast cancer with 88,000 controls, and they looked at healthy lifestyle, and also they looked at genetic risk, because this biobank also collects tissue samples like blood from individuals, and they looked at single nucleotide polymorphisms and divided people into high, intermediate and low risk of breast cancer. And after a follow-up of 10 years, they were able to show across all risk factors associated with genes that the healthier the lifestyle, the less your chance of developing breast cancer. So if you were in the high genetic risk, you could still reduce your risk of developing breast cancer by 40%. Now, the caveat to this is that this doesn't include people who are carrying mutations in their BRCA gene. So what about diet alone? I mean, the latest meta-analysis on vegan and vegetarian diets show that overall vegans can reduce their risk of developing cancer in the order of about 15%. There isn't consistency across the different sites of cancer, but overall the incidence does appear to be reduced. Now, of course, you don't need to be 100% plant-based to achieve some of these good outcomes from cancer. You need to be predominantly centering your diet around whole plant foods. And this large study followed 170,000 men and women in the US for over 30 years. So it's data from the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, and they looked at 5 healthy lifestyle factors whether people had ever smoked, they were a healthy weight, healthy diet, regular physical activity, and moderate rather than excessive alcohol consumption. And the healthy diet was taken as that which was most adherent to the alternate healthy eating index. And you can see that positive points are given to high intakes of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, unsaturated fats from plant sources and omega-3 fats, and low intake of red and processed meat, processed foods and drinks, and low intake of salts. And what they were able to show after this long follow-up was that if you had the best diet, you could reduce your risk of dying from cancer by 30%. But if you had all these 5 healthy lifestyle factors, you could reduce your risk of dying from cancer by 65%. And in addition, good side effect, you reduced your risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. And individuals who are following a healthy lifestyle at the age of 50 lived 12 to 14 years longer than those who are not following a healthy lifestyle. So for me, the focus on cancer prevention should be to emphasize the overall diet pattern that should be predominantly plant-based. I don't personally concentrate on individual foods. We should be raising awareness through public health campaigns and education campaigns. We need better education for healthcare professionals, and then we need to address the social, economic, and cultural factors that are so important in the lifestyle choices that are available to us. So we should be advocating and implementing policy and environmental changes that increase access to affordable, nutritious food, for example. We should be providing everyone with safe, enjoyable, accessible spaces for physical activity. And we need to be clear on the messaging on cancer prevention, including honesty about the impact of alcohol consumption. Now, all of these lifestyle factors act together to really address the key mechanisms at play in cancer development. So this is just a reminder, and really these mechanisms are at play for all chronic diseases. So inflammation is at its core, and diet, lifestyle, physical activity reduce inflammation and also oxidative stress. Healthy lifestyles reduce the chances of insulin resistance, reduce exposure to carcinogens such as red and processed meat and persistent organic pollutants, and also potential carcinogens in processed foods, for example. It promotes a healthy gut microbiome, which is implicated in preventing cancer, and also healthy lifestyle factors mean that you regulate hormones such as estrogen and insulin-like growth factor and insulin better and more favorably. So what about diet during cancer? I mean, I think it can be summed up by saying more research is needed, because we have very little research on actual sort of diet patterns during cancer treatment. But I think the guidelines across different countries are pretty clear, and I've chosen the ones from the American Cancer Society just because they're clearly documented on their website. You know, they emphasize plant foods over meat. They emphasize eating colorful fruits and vegetables, limiting high-fat animal foods, so that's really sort of saturated fats and of course red and processed meat, limiting smoked, salted and pickled foods because these are associated with increased risk of cancer, and eat plenty of sort of high protein snacks. And although, you know, dairy continues to be recommended within the American guidelines, you know, you can get enough high quality protein from whole grains, cereals, beans, and good combinations of ingredients in soups, for example. And then of course people may need calorie replacement shakes and supplements. And I'm not really going to get into the detail of exact nutritional advice because clearly out of my comfort zone, and also we have got a specialist dietitian coming and speaking to us in a couple of weeks. But I think what I wanted to really highlight is that we probably need to do better. And I guess I'm speaking here of my own experience. I work as part of the Cancer Centre at Guy's, which is part of King's Health Partners. And, you know, on their website, we talk about butter and cheese and cream and honey and syrup and biscuits and cakes and full-fat yogurts. And I think we could be providing better education on healthy diets while still supporting our patients to maintain a healthy weight during their cancer treatment. And our situation is not unique. I mean, this was the most recent study I could find, and I haven't found a study from the UK. But really, dietary recommendations during and after cancer treatment are consistently inconsistent, essentially. And when they surveyed 21 different cancer institutions in the in the US, only 4 really provided dietary recommendations, and overall, the guidance lacked consistency. So we need to do better, because what we do know is that diet and lifestyle counselling and interventions during cancer treatment can help people feel better, keep up strength and energy, maintain weight and store of nutrients, help tolerate treatment side effects better, lower the risk of infection, and improve recovery from things like cancer surgery. And this study shows in a small group of women with breast cancer receiving chemotherapy that, again, we're not doing so well. This study followed people during their chemotherapy and measured their height and weight and waist circumference and performed dietary assessments at the start and then after cancer therapy. And at the end of treatment, they showed that there was an increasing number of women who had an inadequate diet, not meeting nutritional requirements. Their consumption of fruits, vegetables, and beans had gone down, and there was an increased prevalence of micronutrient and nutrient inadequacy, with actually an increase in weight and body mass index and waist circumference. But in contrast, this study from last year showed that in 143 patients with early stages of breast cancer receiving chemotherapy, those randomized to an intervention arm that provided counseling on physical activity and healthy diet in line with the 2018 guidelines of the World Cancer Research Fund, that patients actually had improvements in their symptoms of cancer-related fatigue and quality of life, and these were sustained after 1 year post-treatment, even after the counselling had ended. And during the counselling phase, there was benefits in body mass index, fat mass, muscle endurance, cognitive flexibility, and various other things. But this was not sustained out to a year, showing that probably to improve survivorship, we need ongoing counselling and social support. So what are the interesting areas of active research? I mean, I've chosen 2 areas, given the limitations in time, that really have caught my attention recently. The first you won't be surprised about, because we hear a lot about microbiome and health, but really it's coming into its own in the treatment of cancer, because more and more treatments for cancer have emphasized new modalities that enhance our own immune system, because the whole problem with cancer is that our own immune system hasn't seen the cancer cells as foreign or abnormal and doesn't act appropriately to get rid of the cancer. So enhancing our own immune system, whether it be via these molecules that are called anti-PD-1 antibodies, or a very long-standing treatment that obviously hematologists like myself get involved in, like allogeneic hematopoietic stem cell transplant, they have noted that those people with a healthier gut microbiome, as demonstrated by an increased variety and an increased production of short-chain fatty acids, actually do better. And in fact, increased or excessive use of antibiotics for obvious reasons adversely impact the outcome for these individuals. And this study from earlier in the year really caught my eye. It was 52 patients with solid tumour treated with a PD-1 inhibitor, and these inhibitors act on T cells, and they reactivate our innate T cells to recognize tumour and then hopefully kill the tumour. And what they did was, during and after treatment, they evaluated markers of a healthy gut microbiome, so short-chain fatty acids both in the stool and the plasma. And they also analysed diet information and followed those people for 2 years. And they found that high levels of short-chain fatty acids was associated with a longer progression-free survival. That means a longer remission if you had markers of a better gut microbiome. And this better gut microbiome was associated with consuming high fiber foods, green vegetables, cabbage, and mushrooms. And somehow mushrooms came out top here. I mean, this needs validating in bigger studies, but clearly it shows a variety of whole plant foods high in fiber was key to the healthy gut microbiome. And they were also able to show that the associated level of short chain fatty acids also favorably impacted the immune cells, so T cells and antigen presenting cells. So I think this data is really compelling. You know, I fully support and endorse conventional treatments for cancer, but we could perhaps even improve the outcomes with these new medications by improving cancer diet. The other area that seems to be emerging is short-term fasting immediately before and after cancer therapy. And we've been talking about this for a little while because preclinical models have shown that fasting can protect cells from toxicity of chemotherapy whilst enhancing the efficacy of chemotherapy. But there still remains limited data in humans, but essentially the hypothesis is that cancer cells are growing at such a high rate, have such a high need for nutrients that they don't adapt very well to fasting, whereas healthy cells, as we know, can actually benefit from periods of fasting. So it wasn't until this year that we saw the first randomized study of a diet that it has been coined by Volta Longo, a researcher in the US, called the fasting mimicking diet, where you don't fast completely, but you drastically reduce the number of calories in the day to around 200 to 500 calories. The study group randomized 131 patients with breast cancer to a fasting mimicking diet for 3 days before chemo and on the day of chemotherapy. And they compared to those who were just having their usual diet. And it was quite harsh. First day was 1,200 calories, but days 2 to 4 were only 200 calories. So that's quite a lot for people to change in that short period. And the study was not without issue because for obvious reasons, there was a high dropout rate. It's quite a harsh protocol, but also some people that were meant to be in the control group took it upon themselves to fast. But there was some suggestion that there was an improved response to chemotherapy and less toxicity. But I mean, this is not for prime time. I think it's just an area of academic interest at the moment that might add to the lifestyle medicine toolbox in the future. What I think is quite clear is the recommendations for diet and lifestyle interventions after cancer treatment and to improve survivorship. You know, cancer outcomes are improving, which is wonderful, but we still find that in many cancer types that age-matched survival is less than the general population because people are dying of complications of treatment such as cardiovascular disease and second cancers. Now, no talk on cancer and diet and lifestyle intervention would be complete without briefly mentioning Dean Ornish's study in patients with early stages of prostate cancer. I'm not going into detail about this because you've heard me talk about it for a long while, but this was one of the first studies to really show you can impact cancer progression by a change in lifestyle. And this lifestyle change was a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet, exercise, intervention, social connections and mindfulness activities. And he was able to show that in the intervention group, he was able to reduce the requirements for conventional treatment after 2 years of follow-up. And this was also shown by a reduction in prostate-specific antigen. And importantly, he was also able to show the mechanisms by which these lifestyle interventions actually take place. And so he was able to show in peripheral blood mononuclear cells that there was an increased activity of telomerase and lengthening of telomeres, which are the caps of the ends of the chromosomes. And also you can change gene expression. You can see just in the heat map that before and after looks completely different, which shows that these genes that are being expressed are completely different after the intervention. And just last year, another group published in Science that more specific mechanism of the alteration in gene expression, by showing that cruciferous vegetables, which have this compound called indole 3-carbanols, was able to switch back on a gene called PTEN, which is often switched off in prostate cancer. And the gene PTEN acts as a tumor suppressor. So by putting it back on, you might be able to favorably alter outcomes in prostate cancer. There have been randomized studies in breast cancer, and this was just published earlier this year. I think many of you will be familiar with one of the largest ever nutrition studies to be conducted, called the Women's Health Initiative, in around 50,000 postmenopausal women. And one of the questions it asked was, can a diet intervention that focuses on fruits, vegetables, and whole grains impact mortality from breast cancer? And they were able to show that the answer was yes, that those women who did develop breast cancer but were following a diet that was high or higher in fruits, vegetables, and whole grains, they could reduce their chances of dying from cancer in the order of about 10%. And it's a bit of a misleading statement to call this a low-fat intervention, because the intervention arm didn't actually meet its target, which was meant to be an intake of fat of less than 20%, but nonetheless still increasing fruits, vegetables, and whole grains impacted outcomes. And I think it's just worth highlighting that although saturated fat intake doesn't really increase the risk of cancer per se, certainly for breast cancer and prostate cancer, it can impact survival. This is a meta-analysis of 15 studies showing that higher intakes of saturated fat negatively impact breast cancer survival, and there's similar studies showing that prostate cancer is more aggressive in the context of diets that are high in saturated fat. In colon cancer, similar results. This study looked at 2,000 patients with colorectal cancer and asked them questions about their diet before and after the diagnosis, and this is the conclusion: diets high in plant foods and low in animal foods improved survival following a diagnosis of colorectal cancer. And the reasons to me are obvious when you think back to the mechanisms that I've highlighted that the plant-based diet can address. I think more and more we need to think about the longer term impacts of cancer treatment. In a specialty like mine, we're very much moving towards a sort of chronic, continuous maintenance treatment of many disorders. And unfortunately, it's becoming apparent that these supposed targeted therapies that continue indefinitely are having an increased morbidity on cardiovascular system and the liver, and also increasing the risk of second cancers. So this is an example, again, in breast cancer. We know that women with breast cancer who take tamoxifen, which is often given after a diagnosis and treatment of breast cancer, there's an increased risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, now becoming one of the commonest causes of liver failure. And this was a meta-analysis in the journal Liver International that showed that the prevalence was about 40% in women taking tamoxifen, which is about 3 times an increased risk of those women who don't take tamoxifen. But they were able to show that a higher body mass index and high cholesterol levels increase the risk of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And therefore, sort of diet and lifestyle interventions that address body weight and cholesterol levels are really important for survivorship. So just moving tack a little bit now, the question of supplements always come up. And these are some of the supplements that might be required in the general population. And you're all familiar with the need for B12 on a 100% plant-based diet, iron and folic acid for women who are pregnant or planning pregnancy, and of course vitamin D is a bit of a hot topic now. But what about during cancer treatment? There haven't been many studies, although we know anecdotally from our own practice that many people coming into a cancer clinic are already taking over-the-counter supplements. It's such a massive billion-dollar industry now. But this study looked at survival in patients with breast cancer enrolled in a clinical study in the US. And they specifically asked about the use of supplements, and they're listed there on the slide. And seemingly, even though this was a secondary analysis of the data, they were able to show an adverse impact on antioxidant supplements in particular, and also iron supplementation. And these supplements seem to increase the risk of recurrence and death in these individuals. Now, clearly, this study wasn't designed specifically to answer this question, and there may be some reverse causation here. You know, maybe the sickest and less well individuals were more likely to reach for supplements. But nonetheless, I think we should be cautious and be recommending nutrients from the diet first and foremost, and only supplementing if dietary intake is inadequate. We shouldn't be going above the therapeutic range. I think the only exception to that, but again, keeping within the normal range, is vitamin D. I mean, I measure and supplement vitamin D in all my patients, and invariably they all have a lower than optimal level, because this large meta-analysis of randomized studies showed that raising the level above 75 nanomoles, which usually requires an intake of 1,500 to 2,000 units a day, improves survival after a diagnosis of cancer. So moving away now from diet, everything I've said about diet could probably be said about exercise. It maintains a healthful weight, reduces insulin resistance and growth hormone levels, reduces inflammation, boosts the immune system, alters gene expression, lengthens telomere, and most certainly reduces the risk of cancer recurrence. This is another reference here that's very much worth reading. It's a consensus statement on exercise for cancer survivors. And there's strong evidence that exercise can reduce anxiety and depressive symptoms and improve quality of life in cancer survivors or patients with cancer, and some evidence for improving bone health and sleep. And when it comes to survival for the commonest cancers, there's about a 40% lower risk of dying from that cancer if you are physically active, in line with the current recommendations of 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous activity every week. And this large study was conducted in about 500,000 Americans, just published a few weeks ago in the BMJ, and again is able to show that exercise, and here is a combination of muscle strengthening and aerobic exercise, can reduce the risk of cancer. So the impact of aerobic is definitely more than only the muscle strengthening, but both together can reduce your risk of dying from cancer in the order of 40%. So finally, just thinking about complementary or alternative treatments, whether that's the right word or not, but it certainly comes under the umbrella of lifestyle medicine. So it's increasingly recognized that psychological stress adversely impacts our hormones, particularly cortisol and adrenaline, which downstream results in immune dysregulation, suppresses the immune system, increases chronic inflammation, and studies show that that psychological stress can increase cancer progression and metastases, and reducing both quality of life and survival. And again, this is an excellent reference, up-to-date literature on the topic. So what seems to be clear is that we can make an impact by supporting our patients to undertake stress-relieving activities such as mindfulness meditation, yoga, tai chi, and obviously physical activity. And this paper was just published a few weeks ago, a systematic review and meta-analysis on mindfulness-based interventions, which really does help with anxiety in patients with cancer, which is a real problem we see every day in our clinical practice. And another alternative for conventional analgesia, again, a systematic review and meta-analysis, that acupuncture and acupressure does seem to improve cancer-related pain and reduce the use of analgesics. So I mean, I appreciate this is not always available on the National Health Service or reimbursable, but there is some evidence, albeit only moderate rather than strong, to support some of these practices. So I'm coming towards the end, and what I hope that I've highlighted is that although survival and cure rates for common cancers are increasing, I think we need to start thinking about survivorship and increasing emphasis on reducing side effects and chronic illness, such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and second cancers, which we all know can be positively impacted by a diet and lifestyle approach. We therefore need to have better survivorship programs, I think, going forward, and often this falls back to primary care physicians because we're encouraged to discharge our patients who've completed treatment sort of within a year or two from our cancer clinics. So ongoing challenges remain the rising burden of cancer globally, the aging population, and the rising incidence in the young. For me, there's an overemphasis on treatments compared to the impact we could make through preventing cancer. And I also am not terribly positive about the drive for sort of precision medicine, precision nutrition, because really money is mostly spent on developing treatments that will benefit a few. You know, I've heard some statistics that we spend most of the money on a person's healthcare in the last 6 months of their life, whereas I think if we had more emphasis on upfront treatments for preventative action on cancer and of course cardiovascular disease, quality of life would certainly be improved. And this is really due to poor investment by policymakers in making healthy lifestyles, be it diet or physical activity, accessible to all communities. And I think this has been further highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So in summary, a large proportion of cancers are preventable. Unhealthy diets are a major contributing factor, and we really do have the chance to positively impact cancer outcomes by addressing diet and lifestyle. So thanks very much for listening, and very happy to take some questions.
Hi Shireen, thank you. That was fascinating. I was just taking pictures and making notes at the end. We have already got a lot of questions, but I want to kick off with one that's often talked about in the media, which is sort of the conversation around sugar and the fact that people report that sugar feeds tumours. How true is that? And if so, should people be avoiding fruit? I know that that's one of the questions that we have. Should people be moving more towards vegetables rather than fruit?
No, I mean, to answer that question about fruit, I mean, certainly the answer is no. I think one of the most impactful things you can do for cancer prevention and survival is increase the amounts of fruits and vegetables. But as you well know, mainly concentrating on a variety of whole plant foods, so whole fruits and vegetables, not the juice. I think the confusion with sugar really comes from the fact, you know, that clearly cancer cells require a lot of glucose because they're very metabolically active, but so is every other organ in our body, and particularly, you know, the heart and the brain. We all rely on sugar, and so just it's a very simplistic model to say sugar feeds cancer and therefore we should avoid it. I mean, I think we should be avoiding sources of free and added sugar, and that is mainly through our consumption of processed foods, sugar sweetened beverages, etc. But we shouldn't be limiting natural sugars, and you know, particularly fructose is such an evil compound that seems to have been added in its free form to so many processed foods that then, you know, elevate our triglycerides and contribute to obesity and inflammation. And you know, there are suggestions in the literature. There's certainly one study from a French cohort that shows that the consumption of processed foods, and at the time it was a big picture of a donut on the front of the BMJ issue of that week, that you know, increasing consumption of processed foods increases your risk of cancer. So there may be cancer-containing chemicals and agents within processed foods that we're not quite aware of, but I think the main contribution is through overweight, obesity, and inflammation.
Great. So another dietary pattern that eliminates sugar is the ketogenic diet. And obviously there's been quite a rise in sort of popularity of keto diets, and it's even been pushed by some physicians. What are your views on ketogenic diets for people with cancer?
Yeah, so clearly it is an area that's being researched, and there could be that for some very rare niche tumours it could be impactful, and a particular focus of researchers for some of these aggressive brain tumours like gliomas. But I mean, I hope after listening to me for 45 minutes it will be clear that a keto diet or a low carb diet is going to eliminate every single healthy food that I've talked about, and it will negatively impact the gut microbiome that's becoming increasingly important in cancer outcomes, and it's going to negatively impact long-term health outcomes, because we know limiting whole food carbohydrates like whole grains and beans and fruits and vegetables, which are often limited, aren't they, and replacing that with animal sources of protein and fat will increase the risk of cardiovascular disease, second cancers, type 2 diabetes, etc. So it really doesn't make sense to me at all. And there is laboratory data for sure showing that some cancers actually thrive on ketones. So it's not as black and white as to say, cancer cells only require sugar. We can all switch our body cells to requiring ketones as well. So the data are not compelling for me, and we've got decades of research on a more healthy, sustainable diet pattern.
Wonderful. Another big topic when it comes to cancer, which you of course touched on in the presentation, but it'd be great if you could explore that a little bit more, is about dairy. And what are your views on that? There's a lot of different questions in the inbox about dairy, and is that something that, are there enough studies, is there enough evidence, and what do you recommend?
Yeah, so the studies, there's loads of studies, you Google it and there's hundreds and thousands of studies looking at this question, and it's complicated because it's always complicated when you take a single food or food group or food type in its isolation, and then look at outcomes, because it always depends on instead of what or with what. And with every outcome when it comes to dairy, if you're eating dairy instead of red and processed foods, your health is probably going to be a bit better. But if you're eating dairy and not enough fruits and vegetables, your health is definitely going to be worse. So the data is mixed. I think that's the bottom line, which is why none of the guidelines actually go into specific detail. For me, the clear-cut data are, well, it's not even clear-cut, but the strongest data is supportive of dairy increasing your risk of prostate cancer. And there's some good mechanisms and several meta-analyses that show that increasing amounts of dairy in the diet increase the risk of prostate cancer, and potentially a more aggressive type of prostate cancer. The second strongest evidence is for endometrial cancer, and both of those are hormone driven, so it kind of makes sense. But for other cancers, it's less clear. And the data, when you look for colorectal cancer, there's potentially a benefit, but I have to caveat that with the reason for the benefit is the calcium, and calcium supplements also benefit those that are actively trying to reduce their risk of colorectal cancer. So my view is that dairy is not necessary in the diet. It's not relevant for nearly 70% of the global population who have lactose malabsorption. There are better choices to make, because studies have shown that soya, for example, soya milk, can actively reduce the risk of breast cancer and prostate cancer. Yeah, and I think, when you take it all together, there is just no need, but I don't think we're ever going to be able to answer for sure, does it cause cancer? Because there's so many different types and so many different factors within an individual that impact overall cancer risk.
Definitely. And just to touch on what you said about soya, another really controversial one, of course, we're talking about minimally processed soya. so edamame, tofu, tempeh, rather than the really processed soy burgers and things that are now available in the market.
Yeah, so I mean, a really healthy food, as you know, to incorporate in a plant-based diet, 2 to 3 portions a day has been shown to actively reduce the risk of various cancers, and specifically breast and prostate cancer. And really, it's been shown certainly in, I think some of the strongest studies are in South Asian populations, sorry, not South Asian, Southeast Asian, so sort of Chinese, Singaporean cohorts, showing that, if you're eating soya from adolescence, you impact your breast cancer risk in a positive way later on in life. So it really is a healthful food, and it's, at the end of the day, it's a legume. So what's not to like? I think there's continued sort of media misrepresentation about plant estrogens, which don't act in the same way as the estrogens you get in dairy milk, for example, from the cow.
Definitely. So one of the questions that we received was about what science tells us about the definite links between cancer and stress. Are there any resources that you know of on this topic, and is there any definitive evidence about the links?
Yeah, so hopefully when people get the slides, you'll be able to look at that one good review that I found quite helpful. I think there's a lot of sort of mechanistic data, showing that chronic psychological stress or people with anxiety and depression have activation of the adrenal system and increased levels of inflammation and lower sort of activity of T cells and NK cells, and that's kind of slightly extrapolated to then potentially impacting cancer outcomes. So it sort of makes sense, but unless I've missed, I haven't seen sort of big studies, definitely showing improved survival and an outcome just because one intervention was done. But there's no doubt that it improves quality of life and reduces anxiety and depression in people with cancer when stress sort of management activities such as yoga potentially, or mindfulness-based stress relieving activities are undertaken during cancer treatment. So and when you look at sort of case series, a bit like that book, Radical Remissions, one of the 9 factors that played into these people having a spontaneous remission, in inverted commas, was that they found their purpose, addressed their psychological stresses, found peace amongst with themselves. So I think it makes a lot of sense.
Fantastic. And another thing that kind of crops up amongst kind of plant eaters is the conversation around organic, and whether we should spend that extra money on organic fruits and vegetables as opposed to conventional.
I think it's a tricky one to answer, to be certain. I mean, I think what we know is that various pesticides and agrochemicals have the ability to cause cancer. And we know this because people who live by big farms that spray lots of chemicals have an increased risk of cancer. And there have been some large court cases, one in the US against Monsanto, who clearly produced glyphosate, and millions or billions awarded to individuals who've developed non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And clearly the World Health Organization classified glyphosate, malathion, diazinon, these herbicides as probably causing cancer. So, there's clearly some evidence. And then there's 2 big cohort studies that have reported an association, at least, with reducing the risk of particularly non-Hodgkin lymphoma in those consuming the most organic foods. And this is not necessarily people eating the most plant foods, just organic sort of meat, fruit and veg. But, I don't think this is the solution to our problem, because, there's many issues with organic farming. It doesn't necessarily take the best care of the land. We need to move to methods like, as my father talks about, no-till practices that in itself minimize the use of pesticides by using the improved soil health and the biodiversity that arises. So I don't think it's black and white. And for us as vegans, of course, organic is not going to be vegan, as it's using animal-derived manure. And at the end of the day, most of us don't have access to it, and it's certainly 100 times better to be choosing lots of healthy fruits and vegetables, not worrying about whether they're organic or not, washing thoroughly, and enjoying them, because that certainly is going to be more useful for long-term health.
And if you can eat, you know, pay a little bit of attention to what's in season as well. Like, where possible.
And I think, you know, clearly if you have the option and accessibility, etc., it's a great thing to be able to choose, but it's not going to help us change policy and make healthy fruits and vegetables accessible to everyone.
Definitely. So one of the questions is from someone that is asking about coffee, which is something obviously many of us love and we start the day with. And you discussed the recent study in coffee in terms of colorectal cancer, but in terms of other cancers, is there any information on whether it's beneficial or detrimental?
Yeah, I mean, I think overall coffee has a neutral effect on cancer. There is some data to suggest it reduces the risk of endometrial cancer and liver cancer. And in general, in population studies, drinking coffee about 3 to 4 kind of standard cups a day has no detriment to overall health and may have some of these benefits. So clearly, I think if people enjoy it, it doesn't have any of the sort of acute side effects for you, then I think we've been given a green card from, or green light, I should say, from what I've read of the data. And there's actually a really good review called Coffee, Caffeine and Health or something in the New England Journal of Medicine recently. So you can look up that reference.
Wonderful. So before everyone runs away, we've got time for a couple more questions, but I'm just going to launch the poll for just to get your feedback on this webinar. So please just select your answer there. So one of the questions that I thought was quite interesting, and obviously you touched on in your presentation, was about saturated fat, which negatively impacts upon breast cancer survival. And is there any difference between the impact of saturated fat found in plant foods, like obviously coconut and things like that, versus animal-based saturated fat?
Well, that's an interesting question. I don't think I've actually seen any data, but you might be able to tell me otherwise, Rahini. I don't think I've seen data on coconut oil consumption and cancer. Clearly, there's a lot on cardiovascular health outcomes, but I've not looked. I'll have to check and get back to you. I think for certain studies have shown that swapping saturated fat for unsaturated fatty sources is beneficial for cancer. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that question actually.
Definitely, and I think as you mentioned throughout the presentation, it's not just looking at cancer sort of myopically, but of course the other chronic diseases that, like cardiovascular disease and things, and type 2 diabetes, and we've got to bear that in mind as well. So things like coconut oil are definitely not a necessity, and they are harmful.
And I think most of our exposure now is probably through processed foods, isn't it? And also palm oil and processed foods. So if that's your source of saturated fats, then it's not going to be good. But in isolation, I don't know.
Just from your experience, obviously you've done such incredible work setting up plant-based health professionals UK, and also launching the Winchester University course, which some people who are tuning in may have taken part in. But in terms of cancer, specifically in your work, have you seen people who've actually been able to get really beneficial outcomes just from changing their diet and lifestyle? And would you be able to share some more information about that?
Yeah, no, I have. I certainly have had people who really, usually it's after they've finished treatment, because some of the therapies we give are awfully intense and it's quite a lot to go through. But yeah, for sure, I've seen benefits in weight management, because it's so easy after a diagnosis of cancer to put on weight, improved exercise tolerance, coming off sort of hypertensive medication. So I think these sort of everyday what we sort of think as like, diseases of aging, like hypertension and high cholesterol, I see those sort of impacts. As I say, I couldn't hand on heart say I've improved anyone's cancer survival, because at the end of the day, I discharge people after 2-3 years follow-up. So I'd have to rely on my GP colleagues to advise me whether people are living longer and healthier, but that takes a big study. But yeah, I think you can easily bring down those sort of risk factors for cardiovascular disease and overall health.
That's really wonderful to hear. And so I think just before we wrap up, I want to ask you about where is the best information for people to find out more if they want to live in a lifestyle and follow a dietary pattern that is beneficial for the prevention of cancer and can optimize their health?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly the biased answer there is take a look at Plant-Based Health Professionals website under the health zone. There's webinars, there's fact sheets, there's articles I've written, and other people, of course, from the team have written as well. So yeah, we've got loads of resources, and if you're new to this, then our plant-based version of the Eat Well guide is a really good way to start, because it sort of sticks with sort of the accessible foods that we're used to. And then some of the references, obviously, I've quoted are really worth reading when people have time.
Yes, and we will circulate the slides to everyone. A lot of people have asked about that. But if you want to share this video with anyone, it's going to be available to Plant-Based Health Professional UK members in a couple of days via our website, along with all our previous webinars. We've done about 15 so far. But hope everyone who's tuning in will join us in a couple of weeks' time for the next webinar, which is on nutrition management of patients undergoing cancer treatment, which I think will complement this one really nicely, and hearing some really practical suggestions for healthcare professionals as well as people undergoing cancer treatment who want to tune into that. So please spread the word. Thank you so much, Shireen. It was a fascinating presentation. Of course, I've seen your other presentations on cancer from our website and in person, but there was so much new information and knowledge poured into this. It was really, really fascinating. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure as always.